Okay, let's start. Can you hear me, everybody? Okay. Well, dear IPAM members, partners, and friends, I'm Karim Gay, representing here the AAA Initiative Foundation, which serves as the Secretariat for the International Platform on Adaptation Metrics, or IPAM. Today, we have the pleasure of showcasing the work of one of IPAM's key member organizations, the Higher Ground Foundation. As you know, IPAM's primary focus is on metrics, essential tools for management. Our mission is to define appropriate metrics to assess progress in climate change adaptation projects. The Higher Ground Foundation has developed a groundbreaking tool in this field, the Vulnerability Reduction Credit. This economic measure offers a tangible way to assess the impact of climate adaptation projects, addressing a complex challenge in our sector. Our webinar today will be led by three distinguished IPAM members from the Higher Ground Foundations: Linus Adler, Paul Forti, and Carl Schulz, who is our current chair of IPAM. Carl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karim, and thanks for everyone who joined. Could you stop sharing? So I will start sharing. Okay. So, as Karim mentioned, the Higher Ground Foundation has been working since 2012 to come up with and refine a metric and a corresponding instrument and management system for measuring adaptation progress. So today, we're going to discuss why, what we've developed, and then my colleague Linus Adler will give a case study of some work that we're piloting right now for the Climate Vulnerability Reduction Credit. And then at the end, Dr. Paul Forte will give some remarks, some questions, serve as a discussant, and manage the Q&A for this session. So we hope that this is helpful. If you could keep your questions built up and so that we have a good discussion after our presentation, that'd be most helpful. And let's begin.
Carl, before you begin, could you maybe put it into main presentation mode? We're seeing the preview of...
Thank you. Very helpful. Okay, is it good now? So, all right. So we have, as you all know, I'm sure, there are just so many challenges related to climate adaptation. You know, one thing that motivated us from the very beginning is an inadequacy of funding for adaptation. This is called the adaptation gap, or the adaptation funding gap. And while funding has increased, it continues, and the quantities actually grow in terms of the difference between the needs and the amount available. Another challenge related to funding is how to prove the adaptation rationale and results to funders. In particular, for those funders that have climate finance as their mandate, it's necessary for a clear rationale to be made. Is the project actually adapting to actual climate changes? And if projects don't have such a rationale, oftentimes the funders are forced to just reject the projects, which of course exacerbates the challenge. Now, a third challenge we see is that comparability between different projects and sectors oftentimes creates an inability to really prioritize, consider how projects could go, where we should be emphasizing our efforts. And this issue of looking between projects and between sectors is something that really is a difficult challenge, given the diversity of considerations when you're talking about adaptation. Oftentimes, those in policy arenas talk about the need for bringing in more private finance for adaptation. But oftentimes, in particular, where most of the benefit comes from a public good, where there's no clear revenue stream and return on investment, there's not really a clear role for the private sector to be involved in bringing in its money to scalable and scale adaptation solutions. There's also oftentimes a challenge understanding how projects are progressing, how they're working. Are they useful in reducing vulnerability and enhancing adaptive capacity? And oftentimes this relates to challenges in coming up with robust monitoring and robust verification of adaptation actions. And then a final challenge we are calling out, at least, relates to sustainability. All too often, projects are defined not over generations, but over a year, 2, 3, or maybe 5 years. Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because the climate is changing, and adaptations undertaken today, we believe, should be continued and modified over those generational scales, not over year-to-year scales. But there's no clear way to really understand and to encourage sustaining projects. So that's the motivation we had to see how we can address those challenges. I mean, climate vulnerability reduction credit is our proposal. What it is an independent, fungible mechanism that has a number of different key features. One, it can prioritize projects because it compares across sectors and across project types. It also establishes through its sort of logic and the requirements for what needs to be undertaken to qualify projects to earn VRCs. It establishes a clear, transparent climate rationale. It can serve because VRC can be priced, can serve as a financing instrument, and as a consequence, it can leverage additional finance, including from the private sector. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanism itself. It's 50 euros in avoided impact costs, adjusted by the per capita income. It's governed by what we call the VRC standard framework, which has a number of principles under which projects need to meet in order to qualify. Once projects are qualified, then it can be validated, and they can over time, monitoring reports can be verified based on the standard framework. So back to the calculation, I said it's 50 euros avoided impact costs adjusted by the income of the community where it's undertaken. This means explicitly that an AIC, an avoided impact cost, which is a reduction in economic losses. And I should note that economic losses doesn't mean that it has to be monetized financial. We can be talking here about opportunity costs associated with, for instance, people needing to spend time and effort to fetch water a kilometer away from their households, rather than simply because they don't have water resources nearby. And then we adjust by the IEF, or the income equalization factor. And this is something that's applied to communities that are below the middle income threshold, or a lower per capita income of the community, not the country, equates to a higher factor, so more VRCs can be generated. This way, we're not just protecting assets, but we're considering this from the perspective of human vulnerability. So more on how to quantify VRCs. What's the process of doing this? that simple equation is relatively simple, but the process of actually quantifying the VRCs requires a number of different steps, and this is where the detailed work needs to apply. First of all, a project needs to understand future climate, and it needs to understand what are the drivers, climate drivers, that will impact the project and how the project is going to address those climate drivers. So there needs to be climate projections available. And then you have to undertake impacts and impacts costing. The impacts costing is the basis for the avoided impact cost figure. And that requires a lot of work to figure out, well, is there a loss of crop productivity that can then look at market prices? Based on that, you can look at, well, how does the adaptation project avoid those impacts, and what are the corresponding avoided impact costs, or AIC, involved? So that requires further work. Then you have to multiply by the IEF. And so in a community with, say, $1,000 per capita income, the IEF may be about several multiples, but it depends on the World Bank's threshold between the middle income, the lower middle income, and the upper middle income. Then you divide that by 50 euros, and the result will be the number of VRCs that can be generated. So I'm just going to run through a quick project example that brings in a little bit on the potential for leveraging possibly private finance. So in this example, we have 3 different parties. Now, of course, this is a simplification, but on the one hand, you have the funders. These are people who are looking to support adaptation projects. Then you have the farmers. The farmers, or other adaptation projects, it could be a coastal defense, it could be any sort of vulnerable community, vulnerable system where you have an issue, and then you have the Higher Ground Foundation serving as a moderator. So let's take this example where, let's say there's a farmer that's facing climate change related crop loss. Then we have a situation where there's a funder who wants VRCs. Perhaps it's a part of their climate finance requirements. Perhaps they're either impact investors, or perhaps it's someone who is looking at a philanthropic benefit, or perhaps looking at their own interests. So the farmer or the adaptation project then identifies, well, what projects could potentially reduce their vulnerability, but they require money to execute this. So they start preparing a project design. And it just so happens that they find this funder, or the funder identifies the project. Meanwhile, that project design is reviewed by the Higher Ground Foundation, and the project's registered. Now, back to the funder and the farmer. The funder talks to the farmer and says, I'll make a purchase agreement with you. The farmer says, okay, so they have a sale. And based on that, the farmer has a document that could be used as the basis for securing a loan, because it shows a potential revenue stream over and above anything else they might have. This could apply for a project where there's no other revenue stream at all. With that, a loan's gained, the project is implemented, and it's monitored over a period of time. It's verified, and it's submitted to the Higher Ground Foundation for an award of VRCs. Based on that, The VRCs are then sold to the funder. And what is the result of this? Funders demonstrated real support that he can say is solid to the vulnerable community that he's been funding through the purchase of VRCs. Crucially, the farmers gain crop yields and vulnerability reduction. Their livelihood is maintained, perhaps enhanced. And you have a happy farmer. Everyone should be happy. So I'm going to turn this over to Linus Adler, who's our technical director, who's going to walk through one experience we've been doing in Côte d'Ivoire with VRCs. So I'm going to stop sharing, and so you can start sharing.
Thanks, Carl. 1 second. Hopefully everyone sees that. Yeah, thanks, Carl. Just before I start, I just want to note that I'm very fond of the preceding slide because I think it's probably the best slide you're going to see all day, unfortunately. But I'm fond of it because it does a really good job of illustrating a VRC market and sort of that's as a case study. Unfortunately, it illustrates a mature VRC market, and where we are now is really investigating the latent VRC market. We need to better define how the gaps, the capacities, the barriers to actually getting this process underway. We need a market study, but I'll get to that shortly. So fortuitously, the GCF that's funded the UNDP in cooperation with the Côte d'Ivoire Ministry of Environment and National Resources, an overall estimate to look at the country to help develop the country's national adaptation plan. As part of that, they needed to define. They were seeking to define a adaptation credit mechanism for projects in the country, and maybe as something that can be expanded beyond. So knowing that we had developed an adaptation credit mechanism, the VRC, they came to us and said, "Hey, would you like to write this part of the report for us?" We said, "Sure, that's great." And maybe what we could do is turn, as part of this process, turn it into a springboard for taking the VRC from latency to an actual market. So starting in 2021, we began cooperating with them starting with a feasibility study where we examine what's on the ground, what are the capacities, what are the barriers, what's the demand, what's the baseline in Côte d'Ivoire. Included travel to Côte d'Ivoire and discussion with stakeholders in government and the government and business, both in Côte d'Ivoire and beyond. Attendance at a couple of the COPs. And that finished up in 2022, and that's currently being followed up by a market study that will be funded by the UNDP to determine what is the latent demand for VRCs, and that hopefully will lead to a piloting process with real VRC projects in Côte d'Ivoire and eventually elsewhere. So, as noted, as noted in the previous screen, this is a transversal process, a transversal program. It involves 3 different domains of VRC applicability: projects, finance, and the management of national adaptation. And these all kind of link in with each other. So, for instance, the projects is used to help develop methodologies to translate specific validation activities into verified reduction and denominate in VRCs. The finance segment is designed to develop mechanisms for stimulating investment in adaptation through funding of adaptation activities. And finally, this all links up with integration into the national management system that the country is developing as part of a platform for aggregating project outcomes through the VRC as a metric, not the only metric, but a metric of a part of a bundle of nationally appropriate metrics that can kind of transmit results from the project to the national scale. So what was phase one? Well, in brief, it was a scoping and evaluation, a baseline setting effort. And we looked at stakeholder roles and responsibilities, the capacities that were available in country and also in various international agencies. The data, a very important aspect of this was the data and the outputs that we get from the data, specifically what was available and what quality it was, and then sort of where the relevant actors and ministries were going in terms of developing capacities, roles, and data products. And then sort of looked at how could VRCs be integrated into this, and how could we, what would this say about feasibility and, you know, the gaps. So yeah, very quickly, we kind of went in, you know, thinking we could look at any type of adaptation very quickly, just because of the nature of the beast, the nature of the country, the nature of what who we were looking to deal with. We settled on it was probably going to be an agricultural project, and you know, as part of that, we wound up focusing on subsistence crops. Well, not subsistence crops. So one subsistence crop, rice, and one commercial crop, cocoa. We visited collectives for both of them in the country, multiple collectives. And, you know, we talked to different stakeholders, from farmers to the government to finance to people with technical know-how, and also the private sector, and also to people who are involved in export in terms of cocoa and domestic markets in terms of rice. And you know, we found a lot of cooperativeness in terms of you know, people were very willing to share data and, you know, cooperate with the effort. We did find a number of challenges, as I said before. The data was there. It was very siloed. The ministries all, for instance, the ministries all had different protocols for when they released the data, when you could get the reports, how you could obtain it. In many cases, there wasn't, it's probably changing, but there wasn't like a platform for accessing yields from the Ministry of Agriculture. Something you had to order as a bespoke process. And then also, you know, there were uncertainties in terms of, you know, what's the methodology for translating adaptation to VRCs, who on the ground, what was available on the ground in terms of organization, how could we deal with it? And, you know, also it's a complex three-tiered process. So how do we make that appetizing to project developers and funders? In terms of the finance pillar, sort of the kind of the schema that we're looking at is, you know, from the funders, the people who have money would, through this facility, be able to purchase VRCs from people who generate them to support loans, to gain equity into projects, or to support grants. And this would, the support would go to adaptations that would over time enhance the and sustainable adaptation in the country. The challenges to this were several, and they included, as I said, we We need a better understanding of the investor demand for VRCs. We need a pilot project to see how a project can generate VRCs. How well an adaptive techniques can be harnessed and the results measured over time in terms of generated VRCs using our methodology. How these could be integrated into the overall plan, the NAP, the international processes, the way agriculture works in Cote d'Ivoire and beyond. And, as said, the market demand overall. And the third pillar was sort of the national management process. And there are several challenges identified to that. You're all aware, there's no such thing as a universal adaptation metric. So VRCs alone couldn't be like the one adaptation metric for Cote d'Ivoire, for adaptation in Cote d'Ivoire, for agricultural adaptation. You need to define how it can connect to other metrics, to the micro level metrics of production, up to the national level metrics measuring, targets and the overall monitoring, evaluation, and learning strategy. And then, just how this is always envisioned as something that would be integrated into a facility being developed by Cote d'Ivoire in cooperation with UNDP for managing the adaptation project under the NAP. And so how would it nest with that? So that was phase one. The next phase, as I said, is, well, what, where we're able to get to immediately from this sort of step 2.0 is a pilot project. 1.5 is a market study, but I'll show that in a second. To get a pilot project, we need to identify potential partners and, sign agreements with them to develop under our methodology or under our framework, a methodology project document or documents for project, and to develop a method for getting sustainable, replicable, and quantifiable adaptation results that are reflected by VRCs. As Carl noted in one of the previous slides, this can be very ranging from a complex to a hideously complex challenge, depending on the granularity and the sort of the specificity. So we're trying to explore a simplified approach based on good climate data from the ministry, the meteorological ministry there, but sort of typified to good enough results. Sort of for the next challenges for VR finance is to develop a VRC finance vehicle is to determine what legal and fiduciary structure would be needed, or if there's something existing that could be integrated into, to develop contracts, because VRCs, they're going to be a contractual based mechanism, and then how VRCs can be easily funded, specifically funding mechanism through leveraging of financial through private finance. And this we quickly determined, and UNDP determined as well, is we need an understanding of demand. So we need a market study. Finally, in terms of national management and reporting, we need to figure out how to integrate into existing and future NAPs to prioritize, account, and report, and we need to define legal and governance requirements to do so. So with that, thank you very much. And, I know we're going to do questions later. I'll turn it over to our discussant, Dr. Paul Forte, to provide some overview perspectives. And thanks again.
Linus, thank you very much. And you too as well, Carl, for a very interesting and very informative discussion there. There's a lot of material there. I'm just going to do just a couple of quick slides just to try and expand and put a bit of context perhaps on where I see VRCs fitting. As Linus pointed out a few minutes ago, there are no silver bullet universal metrics when it comes to climate change adaptation. And VRCs are not a silver bullet for it. It was clearly distributed as well. But I think it's starting there's characteristics of VRCs which start to point in some of those sorts of directions. And also in terms of explaining how you might look at things in the round, taking a more systematic approach to looking at climate change adaptation, and taking what you can also regard as a more whole system approach. So VRCs are looking at bringing different aspects of adaptation together, vulnerability, income inequalities, and using this as a starting point for adding additional metrics and focusing some of that. Let's go ahead to the last bullet point, thanks. And I think something that came out quite clearly about this in VRCs, and which relates directly to what IPAM's mission is all about. It's about metrics development, but it's not just about doing it in splendid isolation or in a purely academic sense. The application side of things is really, really important. If indicators aren't being used or applied, or there's not some sort of metrics dimension in projects, then IPAM isn't delivering on what it's trying to do. So I think that's a really important aspect to think about. And I think the VRCs are showing us quite clearly is that there's the development of the methodology and the framework, and then there's the work which is going on about how do you actually make this get put into play. And that can be quite a circuitous and quite a more tricky than it looks, the application side of things. It's not very straightforward or very simple, but I think Linus has given us some very interesting insights as to how that's actually progressing at the moment in an African context, which is really good. And I think it also points out that part of the process is not just engaging people to look at the indicators, but also to consider as part of this process, the people you are trying to support, how do their competencies and skills develop insofar as they start using data and metrics of their own accord as well, to actually manage things or perhaps on a more even day-to-day or month-to-month basis. The next slide, please. And as I say, VRCs are pointing with the whole system perspective. So we're not just looking at vulnerability. We're not just looking at finance. We're looking at both of those things together. And if you carry on to the next bullet point as well, we're trying to look at starting to cross silos in this presentation between different domains of expertise or interest. And that's a really, really crucial thing to do. It's very easy to get stuck into finance indicators or looking at a particular sector, for example. What we're also trying to do is understand how these various systems interact with each other. Climate change adaptation is not just about temperature going up and down. It's about a lot of different sort of characteristics and moving parts, which we're trying to look across and incorporate and take part of that. And I think that's very much, and again, something which IPAM has to think about. And I think this contributes to that discussion. It's not just about as I say, the design of indicators or even their application directly, but also the sort of whole system perspective and trying to pick up across the piece is an important part that IPAM should be helping support that kind of thinking and developing in a role. And the last bullet point I've got is it's not easy. None of this is easy. And you're not always thanked for trying to sort of cross into different sorts of domains and things look like that. So if eyebrows are being raised or people are raising questions about these sorts of things as you're doing them, or developing these sorts of indicators and trying to apply them, then that's a good thing, because you're obviously you're stirring things up and getting people to think in slightly different ways as well, which I think is important. So my last slide is really to push across to yourselves. We've had a really interesting and informative presentation, lots of material in there. You may well have some specific questions that you've been thinking about as you've gone through the presentations you want to prepare. That's absolutely fine. Please bring them forward. The other thing I'm throwing out to here is by way of making some of the discussion go. For example, do you perhaps see a role for VRC, seeing as you've some previous experience of them, or you're seeing them here for the first time? Have you, to take it away from perhaps VRCs specifically, if you want to think about issues about whole systems and indicators and metrics about that? and about local training and skills development. These are the different sorts of aspects which are sort of come up naturally from the VRC presentation, and we may wish to carry on the discussion now over the next about 20 minutes or so, I think, is left for the presentation. So if you'd like to perhaps leave that slide up, even just as a sort of an aide-memoire, I will be happy to open the floor to questions from everybody. Anybody, if you'd like to go ahead. If you'd like to raise your hand. Thanks. Joel, would you like to go ahead? And if you'd like to make sure you turn your speaker off as well, on rather, and put your camera on where you can. It's always quite nice to see somebody. Thanks. Go ahead there.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Well, this clearly, you know, it's an interesting approach, and I think there are questions on the finance, and I have some of that. There's also just questions on the valuation. So can you speak about the challenge, or is it meant to be applied to so-called non-market impacts? I'm thinking about human health, ecosystems, biodiversity, and how might VRC work there? Thanks.
Well,
Carl?
okay, it's a great question, and it is intended to really be potentially useful in any context where you're able to come up with an avoided impact cost. And avoided impact costs are not easy always to develop, although there are some simple issues. And we're focusing, for instance, where you have an agricultural commodity price that you can place on it. And so if there's crop loss, regardless of whether that crop is used by the farmer, consumed by the farmer, traded or bought or sold, you have something straightforward. But looking at things such as health, and I should call out that Dr. Forte is a health systems expert, and we've come up across a variety of different health-related areas, and he could speak perhaps more to that, much more to that than I can. But just considering broadly speaking, if you look at the various tools that economists have, there's contingent valuation approaches where there's good enough studies of how much opportunity cost that's not monetized directly, that's not a part of the economy or a part of the trade. You can do things like consider, well, what's the value of ecosystem services that aren't necessarily a part of a market yet, right? And so you can look at how biodiversity loss can potentially impact and be an impact cost, and how there can therefore be corresponding avoided impact costs. I don't know if anyone else wants to say any further on that issue, but yes.
Thanks for that, Carl, and thank you, Joel, for that. Now, there's a stream of hands going up, and I've been noting which order they came up in. So it's over to Samraj next, please, for your question, please, Samraj.
Yeah, first of all, thank you all for that wonderful presentation. My question is somewhat related to what Joel asked. And Carl, as you mentioned that while calculating the VRC, you basically look at the avoided impact cost, which has been weighted with the per capita income. So in a way, you are looking at a vulnerability reduction of the community or the people of that area. So and you mentioned also that you're not taking into account the vulnerability of the asset and other things. So I was just wondering if that could lead to some sort of underestimation or maybe an overestimation of the vulnerability reduction. So how do you manage that? Because finance depends on this. And the second one is, I want to put this into a broader perspective and just ask just a query that how do you think the scalability of this VRCs to the national level so that it can maybe used in for the other finance, the global finances, like the one that is now which is scheduled to be debated in the COP29, like QG, or the new collaborative quantitative goals for the finance. So do you think that this has got some potential or the probability of being a part of it, or how is going to be effective in bridging the adaptation finance gap? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Great questions. I don't know if Linus, if you'd care to answer them. I would say, well, do you have you want to answer any of those, either of those? Otherwise, I will take a stab. Yeah. Let me go then. Okay, so does it overestimate vulnerability? If you have a very, very low income community, say it's a community with $500 per capita income, and you get quite a number of, your factor is very high, right? Therefore, you could be in a situation conceivably where the amount of money spent exceeds the avoided impact costs, right? That's the concern. I think that could conceivably happen. However, the 50 euros of notional value, that could be viewed as something of a ceiling for what would be an economically rational payment. And if you had an IEF that was, say, 10, then any expenditure over 5 euros per VRC would not be considered efficient, right? However, we do see that all too often projects can be focused don't really serve economic justice and environmental justice, but rather are focused in communities that are easier for there to be vulnerability reduction. An example I use, I don't know if it's good or not, but the avoided impact costs for a conservatory in a Beverly Hills mansion could be higher than a village's avoided impact costs, in Chad, right? But we employ the IEF simply because we want to focus on human vulnerability reduction. And we do think that, getting to your second point, scaling is really going to be key for making a lot of small projects work. So there's a lot of operational challenges there. Looking at the project level, we're engaging more with cooperatives than we are engaging with farms. Sure, a big agri-farm interest has a scale where this would work, but we need to be talking collectively. And I think that's where we're going to see that projects become more, that this creates a way to encourage more scaling, more incentives as you organize around a structure like this and create an ecosystem where you have people who are incentivized to chase after where the vulnerability is. Professor Huck, who just recently passed away, talked about how Bangladesh is rich in vulnerability. Well, what does that mean? Well, in the case of vulnerability reduction credits, you're going to want to seek after that vulnerability. Talking scaling beyond the project level, though, I think is very, very critical. And I think it's important that we do look at national and international objectives to try to allocate resources where the need is. And this, by having an IEF, does focus on the human vulnerability side rather than just protecting assets. And because a VRC is a VRC is a VRC, once you actually award them, then you are creating an environment where these things can actually, the information that a VRC conveys, and perhaps even the financial transaction, can be conveyed across any scale, which allows for it to be useful, everything from the individual household all the way up to global targets. And so we do hope it has a role within that entire spectrum of scale.
Linus, do you have anything you wanted to add to that? Because, yep.
Yeah, only the first one. Sorry, I couldn't unmute.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Carl made my main points. I guess I just reinforce on the first issue of distorted investment or underinvestment versus overinvestment. I think in approaching the IEF, our premise is that adaptation in poorer communities is inherently underinvested in already. And there's much more, there's difficulties in finding investment in the global South, whereas places like Miami and New York and Europe there's going to be plenty of investment in adaptation. So that was sort of the IEF. It's a kind of a moral and market corrective, and based on the premise that the first $500 earned by a poor person is worth more to them, or a poorer person is worth more to them than the $500 earned by a millionaire. So that's just what I wanted to add to Carl's.
Thanks very much. Thanks. That's a very stark and a very, very well-made point as well. I think it really sort of brings it home quite neatly. And we've got about 10 minutes left. There are two people who've got their hands up, and I've got them in the right order. And we've got Vivek in the chat box as well for a third question after that. So, Jonathan, over to you. You're next in the queue.
Thanks, Paul. I've got a couple of questions, but my first question really is if you could tell us more about how you identify and deal with new project opportunities, and specifically, who pays for developing the methodologies?
Good question. I see. You want to take it, or I'll take?
Go first, and I'll.
Okay. Well, who pays? Who pays? That really depends, doesn't it? I think one thing that we're focused on, and when it comes to this issue of sort of a market study that we hope to, I mean, it's right now we're just finishing up, and UNDP is going to support something. It's already RFP'd and all that. Who pays? It would depend. In the case of agencies like the GCF or USAID or UKFCDO or groups like that, the African Development Bank, they already spend a lot of money on monitoring and evaluation. Would this be a good way for them to allocate their resources to have something that is sort of universal, standardized, and everyone could understand? Well, that's one bucket of funding. Who pays? Is there a community that's motivated and knows that if they were able to convey clear climate rationale that could be conveyed through VRCs, they could organize and they could develop a VRC generating project, get it registered, and then say to the world, okay, look, we've got a project. It meets all these standards. It follows this logic. It is a climate project. It brings about these results. These are very scientifically oriented, ex ante, and then it's going to be an ex post in terms of we're going to continue to do it. So they could pay in those instances. So I think that's really important, is that it's open to whoever has motivation. But it's also something I should note that depending on the type of project, it could be a lot of upfront work, in particular if there's no methodology in place already. And so it could be considerable cost in some instances and less in others. But once we get methodologies developed for a particular type of project, then the costs become much lower. And so we are looking towards institutions that perhaps are already doing work on trying to assess vulnerability to see how they can deploy and work through these efforts to help enhance their own interests, but also support the interests of communities that are vulnerable by helping them to generate VRCs. I hope that helps.
Thanks very much, Carl. I'm conscious now, all of a sudden, there's several more questions in the chat box. Linus, if you wanted to make a quick comment on that, please do so. But otherwise, I'd like to proceed immediately to Susie to make sure she gets her question in as well. Shall I go ahead to Susie? Susie, go ahead, please.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the presentation and always thought-provoking. So I have 3 questions, and who knows, maybe they lend themselves to future webinars. One is that your VRC approach really is about generating funding, essentially. It is not very much about assessing the quality of adaptation. And it is also based, if you will, on a theoretical assessment of avoided costs of impacts, as opposed to the actual reduction of vulnerability. So many adaptation projects don't necessarily do that, right? And because the context is complex and there's many reasons. So in some ways, my question is, how do you need to maybe put in some additional criteria for handing out these credits to assure high quality adaptation? And how do you handle the difference between, if you will, the actual versus theoretical vulnerability reduction? So that's one question. The second one is, what kind of policy context do you envision needs to be put in place that actually creates a market for these vulnerability reduction credits? And the third one relates a little bit to that question of quality, which is that, in my experience, indicators can really be used for good and for bad. When they become sort of a bureaucratic accounting mechanism, they tend to get away from the actual intention of reducing vulnerability. So an approach like yours feels to me like it could be easily misused for simple profit making, as opposed to for helping actually, the benefit going to the communities actually receiving the adaptation project. So I'm just wondering what mechanisms need to be put in place to make sure that VRCs are actually beneficial and not like so easily misusable just for profit. So big questions, but I hope we can at least get started on those.
We've got 5 minutes for that. Go ahead.
Well, they're great, and I think a lot about it, and Linus does, and Paul, but we have something called the VRC Standard Framework, and that's a document. It's big. It's about 100 pages. It's probably too big. And we enlisted nearly 40 different experts across disciplines and across vested interests to try to consider all of these potentials for what's sometimes termed maladaptation, for questions around unintended consequences, questions around communities' consultation. Are they being represented? And those are all above this sort of simple equation. We showed up we didn't have time to get into any details, and we showed the principles under which the VRC standard framework is governed. And this includes a lot of things around making sure that this is not done in a vacuum. It's done within a context of the community, and their interests need to be taken into account. Indicators can be used for good and bad, but you need indicators regardless. And so we also know that we're going to be learning and that we don't have all the answers right now. So one part of the mechanism is that there's a baseline that needs to be established, and then the maximum period for a VRC project period is 10 years. Within 10 years, you have to revisit that baseline, take a look at what's been learned, and so you have an up to a 10-year ex post awarding. But then, because we want these projects, frankly, to be sustained over generations, effectively, a community is a project in a way, and so over time, there has to be a reassessment of what is going on, right? And what the science says, what the social outcomes have been. So we do have certain mechanisms for this. What's the policy context under which it could be put into place? I think that that has yet to be fully clarified for us. However, we do see that already billions is being allocated for adaptation for more vulnerable communities. There's already money spent. Question is, how can we take and tap that existing set of financial flows, expand it, encourage expansion, but take the existing and see how we can do better within that realm? That's, I think, a good starting point. Then considering this from the perspective over how the UAE BLM work program on indicators is approaching this, well, we hope that this is going to be considered one of the series of options that are available that can be deployed, and that there can be some sort of understanding or recognition that this can be useful. But then also, we don't want this to become something that's hardwired in, and you have to do it this way, and you have to use VRCs, because I don't think that that's very constructive either. We want this to be something where there's an interest on the part of people voluntarily to be involved in doing this. And so that we're looking at this from all different angles, and we hope that this will come up with a way where somehow, okay, that's where it works. Maybe not there, but over here, that's I think the approach that we have at this moment. I don't know.
Carl, thank you for that. Susie, is that a satisfactory answer for you?
Let's continue the discussion, all of us.
I think we should, but I'm more conscious of the fact we're coming up to 3 o'clock now, and I guess this is the point at which the webinar must finish or comes up to finishing. There are 3 questions now in the chat box, and I've just got a suggestion. We're probably not going to get through them all by the time we have to stop. Might there be some way of following up with possibly short written answers to these at some point that could be sent around afterwards, just so that we can bring everything to a close on time, and that might lend itself to a short written answers, which could then be circulated around with the slides perhaps afterwards, if that's generally to go. Does that sound feasible? Carl, you're nodding yes. That sounds good. Karim, where are you? There we are. Am I correct in thinking that we must stop at this point, or have we got time to carry on further?
I'm available for more time, so there's more time available.
Okay. Okay. So, sorry, I was just checking on that. If people would like to stay on, we could start into looking at the questions in the chat box. If that's okay. If those people are still here, I see Vivek. If I pronounce your name, I hope correctly, is either Vivek or Vivek. Your question in the chat box is about the organization you're involved with provides support to subnational government-run projects, including locally led adaptation, specifically enhancing livelihoods and creating resilient water supply, flood and drought mitigation in India. And Vivek wonders if integrating VRCs into project feasibility reports would be beneficial and whether it could help in creating blended financing mechanisms. That's the question. I don't know whether Linus perhaps, or maybe as a starting point, you'd like to sort of address that one?
Yeah, I think as VRCs, a flexible mechanism, as just pointed out earlier, it is primarily a funding mechanism, but there's no reason, it's a metric at the end of the day. There's no reason why it couldn't be integrated into feasibility statements to just provide funders and other people who manning the traffic lights on proceeding. Yeah, this is this result is quantitatively good because it produces more VRCs. I know I'm not really expert on the finance part of it. I know that we're talking about the possibility of using blended finance in for project funding. I don't know if Carl wants to speak to that more, if he's done more work with it, but there are no barriers to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think blended finance is a fascinating area because it really brings in different interests to why you would want to be involved in a project. Everything from returns on investment to social benefit. We are in what's called the pilot partnership and implementation phase, PIP. And within this, and if you go to our website, you'll see that we have a request for project ideas. And so if you have a project idea, you can fill that out, share it with us, and then we'll have a look and see if we think that this is the sort of thing that we'd want to work together with you to try to define better and develop. And we're working right now actively with projects that are looking to sort of build it up. I have to say that there's a lot of technical work involved. We ask for a fair bit of things, but if you can get through this, I think you'll have a better idea over the value of your project and how its climate rationale exists, and it's going to be useful regardless of whether it's VRCs or some other sort of project funding. So yeah, please do be in touch and consider this.
And I noticed Vivek's put his hand up. Would you like to come in now on that, please? And I do hope I pronounced your name correctly. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Carl and the others for clarifying. It's Vivek, yeah. That's fine.
Vivek.
And yeah, thanks for that. So we're actually working with like state governments. So these are projects that are actually funded and owned by state governments, and these are all actually looking at resilience and adaptation as the core area. And they are actually actively looking at, because the funding is huge, they're also looking at how we could bring in private sector or banks to sort of fund some part of adaptation resilience building. So that's why I actually looked up the PIP call for projects, but it said it was sort of from 2018 or something, so I wasn't sure if it's still active. But I think there's a lot of interesting work, and we've already covered a lot of the metrics that the VRC sort of requires in our feasibility studies itself. So I think it makes a very good case for exploring this. So I just wanted to ask this question here. But thanks a lot for those things. It was really useful.
Thanks for the question.
Indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Vivek. That's really helpful. I'm pleased to see so many people are able to carry on here as well. And that's quite good. So there are two more questions in the chat. Now, I do notice that the next one from Agustin Materi is, Agustin's not here now. So I'm going to suggest we go on to Nega's question, because Nega's still in the room. Hello, Nega. So Nega's question in the chat box is adaptation as opposed to resilience encompasses use of beneficial opportunities in addition to avoiding negative opportunities and impacts. However, CVRC is a measure of project avoided impact. What about project generated benefits, which are of interest to funders? Can the VRCs complement other economic indicators that tell us about the bankability of projects? Would you like to comment, either of you? Who's going first, Linus?
I'll go first. Yeah, I think probably I would say that the sort of the kind of the ideal of the VRC is that it is related to the reduced vulnerability, the reduced impact costs. So in terms of can it or should it be used to? I mean, a lot of the stuff can be, a lot of the stuff can be, well, you multi. Sorry. Let me just say, is it like a lot of the stuff could be multiple virtues, like you build something and it has more uses than avoided impact costs. So yeah, in theory, yeah, you get value from that. But when it's ideal, the VRC would measure reduced vulnerability, and that it would a best accounted VRC project would measure that component of what you do that reduces vulnerability, that avoids potential impact costs. Sometimes that's a difficult line to straddle, but There's no reason why a project couldn't be good for things other than reduce vulnerability, but that's kind of not what the VRC is supposed to be for. But that's my view. So,
yeah, calculating all of this has to be based on so many assumptions. And also, it's not just the climate that's changing. Economies are developing or regressing. Societies are aging. There could be changes to natural resources that aren't directly related to climate change, owing to resource exploitation, deforestation that, maybe is somehow linked. But so the pathways of causality are very complicated. And what the VRC methodology attempts to do is a good enough job, not perfect, but good enough job of saying reasonable people sitting around a table could say, yeah, okay, that's probably a good balance of where we should say a particular project is avoiding impact cost. If there are benefits, and those benefits have somehow recoup against some climate impacts, then if that's caught up in the net changes, and so, we're doing something that just slows down one loss, but something that sort of enhances it, like, for instance, changing crops types or varieties. Well, maybe that variety would be beneficial regardless of climate change, right? But it does address climate change as well, right? A new variety introduced. So the point is, if we can show that a vulnerable community is made less vulnerable to climate change, and if that addresses something that maybe there's some challenge in terms of what's the way, is it actually addressing the fact that the temperature is higher or the water levels are lower thanks to climate change, or something else? It could be that you change your livelihood, it could be, and I think this would be very difficult to put into a VRC methodology, but it could even be internal migration or, displacing communities away from a coastal area. So the point is, yes, we could be looking at benefits, but the fact of the matter is, we're all going to get this hopefully just good enough to help vulnerable communities. And it's going to have to be transparent and robust in terms of how we adhere to it. And if we can do that, I'm all for it personally.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Linus. And I think a point that's coming out of this too is that VRCs, as you rightly say, are not sort of the be all and the end all. And there's a certain flexibility in how they can be applied and used. And the other thing too is they raise questions. So they take you to a certain point, and maybe they don't go all the way, but you can start to map out how far they do go and where the gap is in terms of where we want to look at other things. And maybe it's VRCs in connection with some other aspects of research or some other metrics that you bring together that start to get you further along the line. So it's part of it's a tool to assist in that sort of thing, not a rigid thing which says, yes, this is inside VRC, this is outside, and those kinds of things. So I think that's an important thing to bring out as well. There's one last question in the chat box. I know Agustin isn't actually here, but why don't we address the question at the same time? It's quite a short one. His question is, could VRCs scale up the current 5% share of proceeds to adaptation from the Paris Agreement carbon market mechanism in the near future?
I mean, this gets, the adaptation fund does take share of proceeds from the hey, great to see you.
So I beg your pardon.
It sort of, you're following against the sort of the adaptation fund's 0.5% share of proceeds of the CDM. And yeah, I know that there's a lot of discussion about Article 6 and how all these things can be done. Yeah, why not? I guess that's my answer. I'm not going to be the one making that decision, but hopefully we can help contribute to the discussion and discuss the benefits and whatever implications and costs could be associated with that as well. But by hopefully introducing a rational, transparent mechanism that allows for looking across types of sectors and projects. It does sort of, in a way, create a leveling playing field between different interested parties, but also focuses where there's the greatest need, the wealthiest amount of vulnerability, perhaps. I don't know, Linus, if you've got any.
Yeah, no, I echo you. Yeah, I echo you. Yeah, why not? It's ultimately a policy, high level question, but we're advocates. We go to the cops, like many people here. We're advocates, not just a metrics organization. And yeah,
I mean, there is a vision we have. And I'm not going to get deeply into it because we've got plenty of work to do just developing, the nuts and bolts, right? But I could envision a world where not only do we have an IMF, International Monetary Fund, but we have an ICF that focuses on global risks and regional risks and looking at resourcing, denominating between currency and VRCs, how we mitigate and hedge for risk between regions. Presumably, there will be some potential for recouping benefit through VRCs in one part of the world where there's a greater need in another, and then it will change around over time. But that's only at the moment fireside chatting kind of discussions. But I'd love if we were to get to that level in international policy discussions as well.
Thank you. Agustin, I see you there. I'm sorry, you must have been below my screen and you hadn't left the show after all. Now you come on screen. Would you like to add up or follow up on any of that discussion there?
Thank you. Thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. Yeah, I was just thinking on the on the Paris Agreement call for equitable funding to adaptation and mitigation, and then the mainstream of negotiations go along with the carbon markets and the share of proceeds of only 5%. So maybe that this could be the case for presenting something that could be tangible in terms of going for that equitable funding. So I was thinking if this what is thought to be interoperable, right, at least, and not only for carbon markets, but also for other emerging markets, such as in my region, for example, Latin America is with the biodiversity credits, right, gaining a lot of traction, and next COP in Cali, Colombia, of the biodiversity convention will be a lot around innovative financial mechanisms for biodiversity, right, and obviously vulnerability and adaptation as part of the nature-based solutions broader agenda is very keen on, right, on generating synergy. So I was thinking on interoperability, right? Is that how that sounds for
sort of
VRCs?
stacking credits, sort of. So you could have payment for ecosystems, you could have vulnerability reduction credits, you could have carbon emission reductions, whatever that mechanism will be called, Yeah, sure. As long as you avoid double counting, right? And that's but I think that we have to keep on working on these, and we have to be thinking boldly. The other thing is, they talk about how adaptation is always local, and I don't think that's always true if you think about it from a global systems perspective, right? In that you can make connections if you have information and contractual tools like a VRC to convey information and perhaps value through monetary terms, for instance, between one region and the other, and allow for vulnerability to be reduced in a zone to the point where it allows for more resources in that area to be freed up for other priority regions or needs, social or environmental needs. Yeah, why not?
Okay, there's VRCs expanding even further into other sectors there as well. That sounds quite interesting. It'll keep us busy for another while. Now, are there any more questions from people still in the seminar room that you'd like to raise, either on the chat box or directly? There's only we're among friends here, so please feel free to put your hand up with anything else you want to add or comment on. And if not, then I think at this point we can draw proceedings to a close with many thanks to Carl and Linus for the presentations and yourselves as well for contributing, for being here, contributing with your questions as well. It's been really very interesting indeed. And I hope you got a lot out of the session. So thank you from myself. Carl, Linus, any last words?
Thank you all. And
Thanks.
let's keep the discussion going. If through IPAM, that's great. I'm happy for us within our committees to talk further about this. We could even have a little working group in that, but also Higher Ground Foundation. Go to our website, join Friends of Higher Ground, and also take a look at the call for project ideas under the PIP program, and just reach out to us. You've got our email